Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for your interest in the session and for making the time to attend. So today we'll be discussing NRGI's latest research on corruption risks in the licensing and contracting of transition minerals projects and the collective actions that are needed to better tackle this corruption in a changing and challenging environment for the energy transition and for anti-corruption work more broadly. So we'll be hearing from a great panel who I'll introduce in a moment, and we'll get straight into questions for them. And we'll leave some time for Q&A from the audience at the end as well. But first, some housekeeping. We've left the chat open for discussion. Please be respectful, of course, with any comments. And there's a specific box for entering questions, which is in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Better to put them in there to make sure that we're able to keep track of them. We also have interpretation available for today's discussion. And if you click on the globe button at the bottom of your screen in the bar again, you can listen in Spanish or French if that's more comfortable for you. The panelists will all be speaking in English. And lastly, we wanted to let you know that we'll also be recording today's session and we plan to upload that to our YouTube account afterwards. So turning to the panel, today we'll be hearing from Arden Sain, who leads NRGI's work on domestic energy transitions. He's an anti-corruption lawyer by training, has conducted investor due diligence, market research, complex financial crimes investigations, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and was one of the authors of NRGI's 10 Red Flags report. Ketukantariana Rafitosin, who's from and based in Madagascar, is the Executive Director of Publish What You Pay and Vice Chair of Transparency International. She has more than 10 years of engagement in the fight against corruption in the extractive industries, natural resources, and beyond. Diane Patria works at the Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, of the Republic of Indonesia, and has plenty of experience in the field of natural resources corruption law enforcement, including orchestrating the national movement in rescuing Indonesia's natural resources, covering forestry, plantation, mineral and coal, oil and gas, electricity, renewable energy, and marine and fisheries between 2010 and 2018. Leah Perushan has been an investigative journalist at Forbidden Stories since April 2021. Forbidden Stories is a non-profit based in France whose mission is to pursue the work of other silence reporters around the world. She's coordinated several investigations into the mining industry, including nickel in Guatemala and gold in Azerbaijan. And she's been lead coordinator there since July 2024, coordinating environmental topics. Last but not least, Dr. Stephen Barry is Deputy Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the Church of England Pensions Board, where he works across the board's investment stewardship activity. He serves as a treasurer and a board member of the Transition Pathway Initiative, a trustee director of the Church Investors Group, senior advisor to Mining 2030, and co-chair of the Global Tailings Registry Working Group. And my name is Susanna Fitzgerald. I'll be moderating the session today. I work on our anti-corruption programming at NRGI and worked with Arden and our co-author Tom Shipley on the 10 Red Flags report. And so turning to the report and first to Arden, it'd be great if you could share some of the key findings from the 10 Red Flags report with us and some ideas for who could use the research in their work. Thanks.
Thanks, Susanna, and thank you to everybody for being here. Yes. So like Susanna said, she and Tom Shipley and I put together this report at the end of last year because we wanted to take a closer look at how corruption in transition minerals licensing and contracting was working and what were some of the real world outcomes from it. So we analyzed 53 cases of corruption covering 10 minerals in 30 countries across 5 continents. And from all that work, we identified 10 common red flags of corruption. I'm not going to go into what all 10 of them are right now. There's not time for that. We'll pop the report and maybe some other materials in the chat before the session's over. Instead, I'd like to spend these few minutes telling you about 3 bigger conclusions that we drew from the cases. So first, the cases we looked at confirmed what we already suspected, of course, that corruption in transition minerals licensing and contracting is a worldwide endemic problem, right? So we found cases on every continent that had transition mineral reserves, in 8 out of the 10 countries with the biggest reserves, in countries of all income levels, starting from the US on down, and then in every mineral supply chain except graphite. And we think the only reason we didn't find a graphite case is just because most graphite's mined in China, where there's very little reliable information on corruption coming out. So no country that has transition minerals mining is exempt from corruption. If you're doing the work, the risk is there. Second big conclusion we saw is that the cases were just bursting with examples of how corruption in transition minerals licensing and contracting is ultimately bad for business. So these days, you hear all sorts of powerful voices out there arguing that strong anti-corruption measures are just going to put mining companies at a disadvantage, add all sorts of unnecessary costs, and slow down the energy transition. And we got to move fast because this is an emergency, right? Recent examples, of course, anybody who's looking around, there's the Trump government's decision to pause FCPA enforcement, and there are mining companies and officials in all sorts of countries arguing that licensing processes should be fast-tracked, non-competitive, closed door, let's just get it done. But in our data set, in case after case, the companies that resorted to corruption found themselves mired in all sorts of chaos, unexpected cost, and delay, right? This could be from lawsuits, arbitrations, political infighting, community protests, worker strikes, you name it, right? Some of these battles kept mines closed for years, decades, and in other cases, even when a company did win some initial advantage from corruption, it backfired over time, and they were sent packing when controversy erupted or the host government changed hands. So the implication of all that for us is clear, right? That in the race for transition minerals and the hopefully cleaner energy future they support, corruption isn't some guaranteed foot on the accelerator. Like a lot of times it's the brakes. The third main conclusion we came out with is that corruption in transition minerals licensing and contracting is already undermining and threatening a just energy transition worldwide. And to know how, you just have to ask 2 questions. The first is, whom is this transition minerals boom really for? Right? And specifically, who's benefiting the most? The answer, our cases said, unsurprisingly, was a narrow band of politically connected elites and big name mining companies headquartered in some of the world's richest countries, right? So we found endless examples of politicians and firms blocking competition for mining rights and capturing wealth and windfall profits that they didn't need or deserve. And if that's the first question, then the other side of the coin is, if these ones are the big beneficiaries, who is shouldering the lion's share of the costs? And here, our 53 cases showed in really devastating detail that turning a blind eye to corruption in transition minerals isn't just bad for business, but for people and for the planet, right? So companies in our data set used corruption, sometimes very cleverly, to enable and cover up all sorts of serious social and environmental harm. So we saw, just to give a few examples, polluted or diverted water supplies in Guinea and Spain, deforestation and illegal logging in Indonesia, destroyed nature preserves and archaeological sites in the United States and Panama, forced relocations of people, communities in Mongolia, the DRC, child labor in Afghanistan and Zimbabwe, and like I could just keep going. Now, anybody who follows corruption or human rights in the mining sector knows that like the buzz around some of these minerals may be new, but the corrupt schemes and the terrible stories aren't, right? Part of why we put together this report is to be a resource for different groups, whether it's investors, companies who are serious about their ethical obligations, journalists, auditors, NGOs, on down the line, to try and understand and get a little bit ahead of what's happening in this space. Now, that doesn't answer the question, what specifically should all of us do about corruption in transition minerals, especially in a political moment that looks increasingly hostile to anti-corruption and good governance work. Luckily, my time's up, and I don't have to answer that right now, but we have a great panel of folks here who are trying to find the answers from a whole bunch of different perspectives in a whole bunch of different countries and institutional settings. So I'm super happy to turn over to them and hear what they have to say. And thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Adam. I think, yeah, really eloquently set out the harms of this corruption as well. Of course, for people, for nature, those impacted by the mining sites on a kind of frontline direct level, but also for businesses, that the kind of the false economy of trying to engage in these sorts of practices. And Kay, turning to you, if that's okay, do the findings outlined by Aaron resonate with what you are seeing across the world in terms of the scale of the corruption challenge in the mining sector and the types of actors involved? And how can civil society best respond, particularly with growing restrictions on their activity right now? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Susanna, and congrats to NRGI, for this great report. First, thanks to Aaron for sharing the findings. Yes, definitely. These findings align closely with what we at Publish What You Pay and our members witness in mining regions worldwide in Africa and elsewhere. They also resonate with Transparency International's recent report, which highlights that over half of the global reserves of 11 of 14 key minerals needed for the energy transition are in corruption-prone jurisdictions. Corruption in licensing and contracting for transition minerals is a major threat to equitable resource governance. And as outlined in this report, corrupt deals enrich a few while harming communities and depriving states of revenue. This issue it's not just local, it is deeply transnational, as highlighted. Politically exposed people, multinational corporations, and financial institutions all play a role in entrenching corruption in the global economy. Our work has shown how opaque deals, undue influence, and weak regulations erode public trust and fuel environmental and social injustices. And the race to secure transition minerals is only amplifying these risks today. Governments and companies are fast-tracking deals, often at the expense of due diligence, environmental protections, and community participation. So without robust safeguards, we risk repeating the same extractive models that have long driven inequality, conflict, and environmental destruction. So how can civil society best respond to this situation? I'd say that today we face a perfect storm: rising domestic repression, corporate influence over policy, and now backsliding from key global anti-corruption actors like the US. This is really dangerous. Cuts to US foreign aid, a weakened FCPA, and funding freezes on USAID-backed governance programs not only limit direct support, but also signal to authoritarian governments that cracking down on civil society and anti-corruption is acceptable. So how do we respond? I see 4 key strategies. The first thing is about diversifying financial support for civil society. With donor funding declining, civil society must find alternative resources, whether through local philanthropy, crowdfunding, or corporate accountability funds from legal settlements, and strategic alliances with environmental groups, labor unions, and tech advocates can help share resource and expertise. Secondly, leveraging stronger global mechanisms against corruption is key more than ever. Even as US enforcement weakens, other jurisdictions, including, for instance, the EU, Canada, and Australia, are strengthening anti-money laundering and beneficial ownership regulations. So civil society should redirect its advocacy to these frameworks and engage with multilateral bodies like the OECD, the ITI, and African Union to counteract, the US disengagement. The third key thing for me would be to build stronger cross-border coalitions. With reduced international support, civil society in the global south must collaborate more effectively, investigating corruption, sharing data, and jointly advocating for greater accountability. Moreover, regional legal mechanisms such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights are crucial tools to challenge restriction on civic space and bring cases to international attention. So the fourth and last thing I'm thinking of is using digital and decentralized strategies for our advocacy. As authoritarian regimes tighten control, we as civil society must embrace decentralized activism through whistleblowers platform, blockchain-based transparency tools, and open source investigations. Community-led monitoring should also be strengthened so that citizens can expose corruption in real time without relying on external actors. Finally, given the transnational nature of corruption, civil society must track illicit financial flows, expose corrupt actors, and hold enablers accountable, whether they operate. So Publish What You Pay is really committed to supporting these efforts. The fight against corruption is a fight for justice. And, despite growing challenges today, we must remain steadfast in our pursuit of accountability. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kay. Yeah, I think easy in these moments to feel slightly overwhelmed by the developments that are going on. But I think you gave a really strong message from civil society of kind of what it's doing already, and very much you and Publish What You Pay are at the forefront of that to push back against this and making sure that we're not caught off guard and we're thinking through how we can push back. And yes, I think your point about a weekend FCPA is a good moment to turn to Deanne as well for the kind of perspective from law enforcement. So Deanne, you work in Indonesia, a major mining country and the world's biggest nickel producer. So from an enforcement perspective, are you already seeing or expecting to see a growing number of cases in the mining sector? And are there any new or emerging trends in these cases? And with, as Kay said, countries like the US stepping back from tackling foreign bribery, what do law enforcement agencies in mineral producing countries need to be able to fill this gap? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Hi, speakers. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, in Indonesia case, I'm afraid to say the situation is the other way around. Yeah. Even though we have a lot of minings, I understand NRGI studies mostly on the legalized minings, but we also have many illicit minings happens. And I have to say the law enforcement are still quite small compared to the situation at the site, yeah. And yes, we have big mining cases, yeah, big corruption cases, but again, like referred by Aaron in the red flags, it's mirroring what happens. A lot of conflict of interest, backing up from law enforcement, political exposed person involving multiple actors, even like foreigners, yeah. We have that, yeah. And the case, big cases will have a lot of political pressures, yeah, like our recent tin cases in Bangkai Island. Yeah? There are differences in perception of law enforcers, including the complexity in calculating the state losses. Even the expert for the campus who calculate the losses, state losses being criminalized. Yeah. Then and recently, yeah, there is a government try to open the mining to public institutions, to campus, to universities. So this is quite interesting. Yeah, it became a heat debate in Indonesia whether campus should be given mining licenses. Big religious organizations also will be given mining licenses. So I can say the license being given to unprofessional. We have problem with current situation. You know what happened if the license is being given to not professional minors. Yeah. So I have to say, future trends, law enforcement will be even more difficult, including when there is FCPA, stepping back from the US. Yeah. So Indonesia, as the source of quite a lot of mining sources, will be object of kind of brutal competition here, and the situation will be affect the environmental. So environmental in developing countries with less law enforcers, and competition with corruption is being less is being allowed. Yeah. So I think it will impact Indonesia in environment situation. And also recently, government is setting up super holding in state-owned companies. Yeah. So many state-owned companies is involved also in mining now under one super holding called Danantara. So most of them placed in extractive industries. And I think the law is being discussed now. They will be subject to law enforcement object. So I don't know. So we hope that Indonesia can also push the private companies being criminalized for corruption like UNCC, but it's not yet happened. But this is the situation now. There is, I can say, I hope not there is not that kind of state capture corruption to involve everyone in the mining, including the campus, the civil societies. Yeah, that's what happened. So for us, I think pressure from outside, from global, from the market is important, like what you did, NRGI, yeah, to ensure that only legalized mining products can go to the market. I think something like that. Thank you.
Many thanks,
5
Tian.
minutes?
Yes, perfect. Thanks for that. And yeah, I think you raise a very important point that our report focused on kind of legal licensing processes, but anyone that works in the mining sector knows that that's only part of the picture. And with the push for more mining and for more material demand, of course, there's higher risk of illegal and illicit mining as well, and all of the negative social and environmental impacts that can entail. Just a quick reminder for everyone that we do have the Q&A box, so please do put your questions in there, and that we can put them to the panelists in a while. But before that, I wanted to turn to Leah. So we reference a case from Guatemala in the report we published, and you were involved in a great Forbidden Stories and OCCRP investigation into alleged corruption and environmental cover-ups at the Phoenix mine, nickel mine in Guatemala. So it'd be great to know a bit more about the experience of conducting that investigation, and also how you see the challenges of carrying out this kind of really essential but very difficult investigative journalism changing in the new geopolitical era that we're in. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Susanna, and happy to be here. So the investigation you're talking about was mentioned as a project in the Red Flag 10, and you wrote that it was because of the mining company does not meet environmental and social obligations. And basically, just to give you a bit of background, we decided to do this investigation back in 2019 because some journalists on the ground in Guatemala were threatened after covering a demonstration of fishermen who were demonstrating because of a pollution caused by a nickel mine in El Estor. So this was the starting point, as always at Forbidden Stories, the silence of a journalist. And we decided to focus on that. And we published a first investigation back in 2019 about these allegations of environmental consequences of the Phoenix mine. And what happened is that we received another some other information back in March 2021. We received a leak of the entire emails from the company and also the documents. So we decided to do another investigation and to see what happened internally. And what we found out based on that leak, but also on open source investigation, so this is key, and also on the ground investigation report, of course, we found out that there is different level of corruption in the Phoenix mine. There is the very local one. Basically, the mine was closed because of a constitutional court decision in February 2021, because they didn't consult the population and the indigenous communities before extracting the nickel. So they decided to stop working, and we found out that the entire consultation of the indigenous communities were kind of partially paid or influenced by the company itself. They finance a local foundation, and they were transferring some money to local associations who voted in favor of the reopening of the mine. So basically, they were already giving some money to local communities to vote in favor of the mine. What we found out also is that they were giving some money through this local foundation to police officers and to different local authorities. So it was kind of, there is some bias in how they are operating on the ground. They were giving some Christmas gifts, potential Christmas gifts, to all the low officials who were in charge of pursuing the journalists, the fishermen. I mean, they were directly giving some money to them. We found out also that our first team who was on the ground in June 2019 were filmed by the company. So we found some pictures of like drone pictures and plans to film our own crew 2 years ago, 2 years before, during the first investigation. So they were really kind of controlling all the communication about their allegedly wrongdoings. And basically, we saw that the demonstrations of the fishermen were already a good thing because we found out some proof of pollution in the lake. For example, this was thanks to the leak. So basically, thanks to this new investigation, we managed to show to the public some information, some proof that we didn't get during the first investigation. And this was key. And just to explain a bit also about other level of corruption, there is another corruption case in Guatemala, you may know about it, which is the magic carpet story. So basically, Solway and CGN Pronico, so the subsidiaries I'm talking about, and another company called Maya Nickel, were allegedly involved in some bribing to the scandal bribing to the president Giammattei at the time. And so they were sanctioned by OFAC. They were put on the OFAC list in the US back in 2023, if I remember well. So this was also a kind of different level of corruption because it was for an access to a port, and it was in the national level, and it is not proven yet. But basically, this shows how what kind of level of corruption you do have. And just to answer your second question, I think that there is key elements that we need, and I know that we were talking about also, you were talking about also before. We need more access to information, of course, especially in countries where there is no access to information and there is no transparency. there is an ongoing political pressure in a lot of country. There is censorship. It's difficult to find people, even on the ground, even local journalists. They now don't want to work on that topics because it's too dangerous for them. And of course, there is surveillance and bribery. So I think we need to work on those topics to see how we can improve and work all together, because we don't work only as journalists. We aim to work with civil society, NGOs, etc., to work all together to make sure that there is less corruption and more transparency. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leah. Yeah, and I think Forbidden Stories has such an interesting and innovative model, I think, to try and counter some of those challenges that local journalists are facing by, taking on their investigations and making sure that the information still comes to light. And the mining secrets piece you did, I thought it was really excellent and interesting. And one of the things I thought that it pulled out so well was just the divisiveness of this corruption as well. Some of the quotes from local community members of these are people living together, and it's pitting them against others, and the kind of long-term impacts of that kind of behavior as well, beyond just the kind of immediate impact of the mine and the business deal that's happening. So Stephen, thank you for patiently waiting. Turning over to you, I think in the anti-corruption community, we're always thinking about what different levers of influence there are to drive higher standards of conduct amongst businesses. And so from the perspective of an investor, do you think that this anti-corruption is a priority issue for investors? And how can this community play an effective role in anti-corruption efforts in this sector more broadly? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Susanna. That's a very helpful introduction. I think corruption is certainly an important issue for investors. I worry that my contribution is ultimately going to be not very satisfying for those of you on this call, because while corruption has been identified as an important topic by a collaborative engagement that we've been chairing, the Investor Commission on Mining 2030, we're in the midst of the process to develop our recommendations for investors, and we haven't published them yet. So, I mean, the report that you've published is absolutely fascinating, and will be feeding into our process, and we will have more to say in due course. But I can bring some reflections to bear from the work that we have done so far. So I work for a relatively small pension fund that's got long-term liabilities. So when we think about corruption risk, we're not just thinking about downside risk to a particular company that we might be investing in. We're thinking about the impact of corruption on societies and economies. So kind of a broad, what's the quality of the civic space that's supporting economic flourishing, not just an idiosyncratic risk to one company or another. We think that mining is a systemically important sector. So not just for a balanced, diversified portfolio, but because of its role in supply chains, because of its role in the value chain and in the transition to a low carbon economy, we need mining, and we need to recognize that, but for it to be done well. And that's part of why we convened the Investor Commission on Mining 2030, and I've tried to share it in the chat, but hopefully hopefully it gets through to the participants as well. But that's a multi-stakeholder commission that is advising a group of investors on building the vision for a responsible mining sector by 2030. It's we're trying to develop a vision for a mining sector that has a clear social license to operate, can meet the needs of society in a responsible manner without driving conflict or corruption, operates in a way that respects planetary boundaries, and positively contributes to social development in the environment today and tomorrow. So that's the program. Back in October, we published a landscape report of our reflections so far on areas where investors may be able to focus to drive improvements or a more responsible mining sector, and corruption features in that report. Strikingly, there is as reflected in NRGI's report, a significant overlap between fragility and corruption, fragile states and corruption risk and resources. 100% of global graphite and chromium reserves are in states that are considered to be corrupt or very corrupt by the Corruption Perception Index. That gives you a sense of the significance of this. And we believe that corruption is likely to increase in the future as a function of increased demand of these transition minerals. In the report that I've tried to share, page 32 has a really nice map that overlays reserves and corruption and fragility risks. The way that investors consider corruption risk is perhaps worth reflecting on. It manifests in the way that investors think around country risk, which may lead to allocation decisions. It manifests in sector risk. A number of investors don't invest in the mining sector because it has relatively high environmental and social and governance risks associated with it. We don't restrict mining sector. We think that it's important to remain invested, remain engaged, and use the stewardship tools, the direct engagement with companies, the proxy voting practices at company AGMs to encourage and to drive better performance. For an individual company in a portfolio, the corruption measures that most investors would look at are backward looking. So has there been an accusation or a court case of corruption? And that might affect the portfolio weighting or even the entire holding of a company in a portfolio. So one of the conclusions, or the tentative conclusions that the landscape report drew, was that these risks are increasing. It's incumbent on all actors in the value chain to work together to address corruption, and that this reinforces the need for transparency. And the transparency is one of the standard tools in investor stewardship, where we can ask for company directors to provide reports on their company activities and to disclose appropriate information. Initiatives like the EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, are really interesting and have previously enjoyed pretty good investor support, backing their programs and backing the disclosures by companies. And I think there's certainly an opportunity for more investors to get involved in supporting the aims of EITI and the disclosures at corporate and national level. As I said, probably a bit unsatisfying for those looking for specific asks of investors, but it's something that the Mining 2030 process is working on, and we'll be reporting later in the year on our deliberations. But thanks very much, Susanna, and thanks for the report. It was a great read.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephen. And yeah, I think it's good to know that there's work underway on this topic as well. I mean, these things take time, and I think encouraging to know that these issues are being looked at by the investor community, and they're taking the time to do that seriously and really engage with the kind of the depths of the issue and all the kind of challenges that poses. So turning to the Q&A, we've got a couple of questions in the box. Just a reminder to add them as well. So just looking at what we've got here. So question from Matthew is the first one I can see. So flagging that there seems to be many new actors getting involved in transition minerals. For example, the case that Pak Dian mentioned about how mining is now open to universities and religious groups in Indonesia. But yeah, as Matthew said, there's also automakers investing in mines. Everyone seems to want a little bit of a slice of the pie. So for the panel, do you feel that these newcomers in the mining sector increase the corruption risks? Or does this trend represent also opportunities to improve integrity on licensing? So Dian, maybe I'll turn to you first, if that's okay, since you've got a kind of concrete example of this in Indonesia. And then afterwards, maybe I'll turn to Kay, and then if anyone else wants to come in, just stick a hand up. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Coming to me, I lose your voice for a minute something. I don't know how.
Yes, no problem. Yeah. Essentially, just yeah, thinking about the situation in Indonesia just now with the kind of opening up of mining to new groups, to campuses, universities, religious institutions, as you were saying. Do you think that, not just in that case, but more broadly, that the entry of new actors into the mining space is a challenge for corruption, or do you think there's an opportunity to maybe do things differently and to improve integrity? What's your kind of instinct on that?
Yeah, maybe government have other point of view that universities can do a good mining practice. Yeah, the legislators. But in my point of view, I think is a challenge for corruption. A more corruption case will happen. Yeah, because when mining being exploited not by the one who knows, who used to, so could be
Jens maybe frozen. Okay. Okay, maybe we could turn to you if that's okay, and then hopefully we'll get Diane's connection back in a sec. Thanks.
Definitely. Yeah, so I think I have mixed feelings about that, because the influx of new actors in the sector is a double-edged sword, the way I see it. It undoubtedly increases corruption risks, but it also presents opportunities for improved governance and integrity. So depending on how these actors engage with the sector and how effectively regulations are enforced. So why new actors increase corruption risks, for instance? Because of a lack of regulatory experience and oversight gaps, for instance. Many of these new entrants, including state-backed enterprises, private investors, and junior mining companies, may lack strong compliance mechanisms or have limited experience navigating governance frameworks. This creates vulnerabilities to opaque licensing deals, bribery, and political influence mainly. Secondly, there is a situation of high competition and fast tracking. The global race to secure critical minerals for the energy transition is really pushing governments to accelerating licensing processes, often bypassing transparency and the due diligence safeguards. This in turn heightens corruption risk, particularly in resource-rich countries where institutions are weak or political elites seek quick financial gains. But where I see opportunities for integrity is also that if we have stronger due diligence by investors and financiers, so Stephen shared, the crafting of these safeguards and standards from investors, for instance, that can be useful. New actors entering the market, especially those seeking financing from development banks, climate funds, for instance, or ESG conscious investors, may be subject to stricter governance requirements. This offers an opportunity to embed transparency and anti-corruption measures in investment agreements. And finally, in terms of civil society and media exposure, the growing global focus on just and responsible mining presents an opportunity for us, for journalists and communities, to pressure new entrants to adopt ethical practices, especially in licensing and contract transparency. So public campaigns can expose corruption risk early and also force greater accountability. So you see, it's two-sided. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, never easy. Never an easy answer in these things. Diane, sorry, we lost your connection for a second before. Did you want to finish your comment? I think you're muted. Diane, we can't hear you. Are you able to unmute your
Okay, sorry, I'm unmuted now. Sorry,
No,
being kicked back 2 times. Can you hear me now, Sue? Good?
all good.
Okay. Like a recent speaker said, like it's like a two sides of the coin. Yeah. Maybe government wants to newcomers to do better, like in campus, maybe a better mining practices. But in other case, for us, we will see the opportunities for more non-technical issues for corruption that proxy, yeah, the bigger player is using these newcomers as their, their partner, but behind that is always the same political exposed person, the same companies or investors who is behind all this mining. So for us, it will increase the risk for more corruption case. So.
Thanks, Deanne. Yeah, and interesting to know, given your kind of concrete experience of this just now in Indonesia. So we've got a few questions from Rahul. There's one that's directly for Stephen, which is about how investors look at mining projects which have elevated profitability, if this indicates an unfair deal. So yeah, maybe Stephen, you could share a little bit about how investors approach this issue. I know you mentioned that they tend to kind of have a backward-looking approach to see if there's been corruption cases that have come up, that kind of thing. But I guess given the kind of different perspectives on the panel as well, interesting to know if, as far as you're aware, investors engage actively with the work of investigative journalists, for example, with reports from civil society, if they're kind of taking in that broad spectrum of information when they see a deal that maybe looks a little bit suspicious. There's also a question from Rahul about framing and the kind of losers from corruption being across a sort of generational issue. Leah, maybe if I could turn to you for a kind of perspective on, given your engagement with communities directly and kind of if you're carrying out investigations, that sense of how do you tell a compelling story about corruption investigations, and kind of what are the things that you take into consideration there? And then lastly, there's a comment about auctions potentially being less prone to corruption at the contracting stage. And maybe, Arden, you could share a little bit about if you saw anything in the cases that kind of indicated that certain types of structures for contracting and licensing processes were more or less susceptible to corruption. So yeah, if we can go in that order, that would be great. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry if you can hear some background noise. It's our air conditioning in this building. Great. How do investors look at mining projects which have elevated profitability? Now, two things to say here. Many investors and most institutional level investors wouldn't make decisions on a project by project basis. We would invest in companies or strategies that then have the expertise to choose those projects. And that's just a kind of, many investments are intermediated in that way. In relation to profitability, investors tend not just to look at the bottom line, but at risk-adjusted returns. And given that corruption risk is a recognized risk, then that absolutely should be factored into any sensible investor's decision-making around a particular project. Yeah, I mean, corruption is absolutely is unfair. And when we talk about social license to operate as being a material consideration for mining companies, that's part of the mix. Corruption is part of the mix there. So I think that's probably the best answer I can give on that question. Thanks.
No, that's great. Thanks, Stephen. And Leah, yeah, do you have something to add on kind of the framing of how we tell stories about corruption, and kind of thinking about how we demonstrate the different types of victims and how we can communicate this effectively as journalists, for example, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think just to give you two examples, in the documents that we had, there were some plans to like relocate the population who was inside the area of interest for the mine. And so they were discussing of spreading rumors of HIV epidemic, so that people can just leave the place, or a set of intentional fires to destroy the crops, so that people just want to leave. So basically, this was like proof. And I think one of the key elements that we need in those investigations are proof, because it's something to have some testimonies of victims, but it's really difficult to get documents and elements, especially on the pollution and on the environmental issues. So I think, the frame is in same at different level. When we have documents, it's better. And if we have only testimonies, we try to get 3 or 4 sources to make sure that it is not kind of only the opposition, or like to have a fair report at the end. So basically it depends on the investigation.
No, thanks a lot for that answer, Leah. And turning to Arin, any kind of reflections on the kind of types of licensing and contracting processes that emerged through the research, and maybe just also picking up on a question in the chat as well about if there were red flags that are commonly overlooked and practical measures that could be taken to address them. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Susanna. Let's see. So in terms of like which red flags are the ones that happen most often, or are, one type of award process more likely to be corrupt than another, our data set is really rich, but we didn't think that we could reliably analyze it in a way that we could draw those kind of conclusions. So for those answers, I'm not really sure. I think it would have been irresponsible to try and draw those kind of bottom lines. In terms of auctions versus one-off behind closed door deals, I mean, as a hypothesis, as a proposition, right? Like an auction seems like a way to prevent corruption. I guess what we would say in our experience as an organization after looking at how auctions work, in oil, gas, and mining over many years, is that auctions are as good as the way they're designed, and there are many different options, but also auctions are as good as the people who run them. One of my favorite examples from years ago was from Nigeria, that there was an official who had run a very corrupt auction for mining rights being questioned in the parliament. And a senator asked him, well, sir, weren't there strict guidelines for this auction? And the official answered, yes, but there was no guideline that was not also guided from behind. So, any rules can be made and they can be unmade in the practice. The other thing that I would say about auctions is that auctions are a chance to include benefits for affected communities, for local entrepreneurs, and for others, like upfront, right? To include, it's a chance to include equity participation, to include maybe some value addition potential, to include provisions for jobs, for environmental protections, rather than just leaving that to whatever the company wants to do after it wins. So in some ways, if you want to prevent bad outcomes, auctions are just as important for that stuff as for anti-corruption.
That's great, thanks. Yes, conscious that we're coming to the end of our time. So thanks for all the questions in the chat. I don't know if we'll be able to address all of them right now, but happy to follow up with everyone as well. Our email addresses for NRGI staff are on the website as well if there is something specific that you'd want to reach out to us about. So maybe just a final kind of question from the chat from Frankie, which was for Kay, which is about Trump's policy to put a hold on FCPA implementation, and what do you see as the immediate risk and the possibilities of American companies in particular dropping their efforts to implement transparency and governance in their operations overseas? So yeah, we'll turn to you for that, Kay, and then maybe if you could also answer a final question for all the panelists, which is, what is the most important change you think is needed to shift the dial on corruption in the mining sector? So yes, we'll come to you first, Kay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I mean, the FCPA backsliding and, all of these global trends around regulations and everything is really, as I said, sending a very bad signal. And I think that it sends companies a message saying you can optimize and prioritize profit over people by opening doors, to corruption and illegal practices and illicit financial flows. But I think there are still some pillars of regulations and anti-corruption standards standing right now. So I see, for instance, all of the omnibus regulation at the EU and the changes, which were also worrying, I would say. Civil society are standing against them and providing recommendations for bettering up things. This is something important. We still have the UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, which is still a major pillar of anti-corruption worldwide. This should be, improved and updated to include as well considerations around the extractive industry, because this is something which is key to our nowadays world. And here I'm picking Raoul's observations on future generations as well. Yeah, because it's our children, it's the upcoming human beings who will, lose from all of this backsliding on regulations. So we have to work for them and we have to keep fighting. And that's my message is really, as a top priority, we need to keep anti-corruption, including in the extractive industry, as a corruption. It's not an easy fight, but we need to continue advocating for stronger transparency and anti-corruption measures in licensing and contracting process. And there's also a need for us as civil society to reinvent ourselves and to engage more with the investors and financial institutions to ensure they apply responsible business practices and conduct rigorous due diligence. And my final word is that while the loss of US leadership is a setback, civil society has never relied solely on one country or funding stream to drive change. We have been able to reinvent ourselves, and the response must be to adapt, strengthen regional coordination, and find new avenues for accountability in an increasingly hostile landscape. This moment calls for reinvention and resilience, not retreat. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kay. Deanne, any final thoughts from you on the most important change we need to tackle corruption in mining just now? Oh, you need to unmute, sorry.
Yeah, when we talk about corruption in mining, yeah, we have to be sure about two things: state capture corruption, like Ari mentioned in the chat, and bribery corruption. And when there is a state capture, it's not easy to investigate. Yeah, it's not easy to investigate because it's embedded, yeah, in the regulation. So this is the challenges. Yeah. So for us, when we talk about corruption in mining, it's not only about bribery; it's also on regulation. Like when I said, being given to the universities, which we thought universities should be partners in the mining to research and do technology and this kind of thing, not as a player itself. Yeah. So this one of the key issues, for example, in transition mineral, in the state the regulation issue, there is no tax revenue from the cobalt in Indonesia. So the cobalt is mixed with nickel. Nickel is taxed, but not cobalt. That's one of the example. Yeah. So why we need also to address this state capture issue on the corruption. And when there is a step capture for me, the answer will be a market pressure, market and public pressure. So, because market is always want to back to equilibrium, yeah, at the end of the day. But that's the only, we hope that there is a market pressure to ensure that only minerals with that mine legally can be sold to the market. This is a global action, yeah, because that's, I think, one of the main issue: market pressure and political will. But if there is political will is the other way around, So we have to look for global pressure through market pressure and public pressures.
Thanks,
That's
Stephen. Yeah, and state capture is certainly something that we're keen to look more at NRGI as well. We're at time, but we'll briefly turn to the remaining panelists as well, if everyone's able to stay on for a couple of minutes. So, Leah, turning to you from your perspective as a journalist. Thanks.
Yes, I'll try to be quick, but basically today 2/3 of the world's natural resources are extracted from in countries where press freedom is in very serious danger, such as Iran, China, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc. We talked about DRC also. So I would say that we need more access to information, more transparency, and of course, cross-border reporting and collaborations.
Excellent. Thanks so much, and thanks for all the work you're doing to bring that to fruition as well. Stephen, turning to you.
Thanks, Susanna. I'm going to shoot one in 2 points, but they're related, so I hope I can get away with it. The first, and I think we've heard this before, is transparency, but transparency as a means rather than an end in itself, and it relies on disclosures being analysed, used, interrogated, and for that to be broadly done by all parts of civil society, as well as investors and companies themselves. So I think that's important. I think the other part related to that is that I believe it's important for investors to recognise the responsibilities and the opportunities that we have to set robust expectations and standards on responsible business conduct, and the interests that we have in protecting civic space and kind of flourishing society more broadly, connected to our investments. So I think that's 2 points, but connected. So.
No, they're great. Thanks so much. And Arden, final word for you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for really interesting presentations and an interesting discussion. My point may seem very big picture, but I think it's important, which is that I wonder whether we need to reinvigorate somehow and broaden what we mean by corruption. Because right now you see all sorts of actors, governments, companies, investors, courts, some media, donors, describing corruption very narrowly, basically as financial crime or bribery, and treating it as sort of a passé topic. Oh, we know that goes on. But I think we need to push back a bit against that, and particularly in a topic like transition minerals and all that, we need to ask more broadly, like, who is this transition really for, right? And going back to the 2 questions I raised earlier, who really benefits and who bears most of the costs? If the gap between those 2 groups is too huge, that in and of itself is strong evidence of corruption, right? Of the abuse of entrusted public power for private gain. We should think about it like that, and we should talk about it like that, even if we can't prove that some crime happened. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. I think that's a really great, powerful note for us to end on. So I will finish up by just saying a huge thank you to the panelists for your really fascinating insights today, and for everyone who made time to join the session. Also, a thank you to Tom Shipley, who co-authored the report with us, Matthew Solomon for all of his support and leadership on anti-corruption work at NRGI, Alex Malmquist for her comms support, always helping us out with our many requests, and to the Heising Simons Foundation for the funding that allowed us to carry out this research. Yeah, huge thanks to you all, and hope to stay in touch. Thanks.